The ballroom blazed with candlelight, gold and white, every chandelier dripping crystal fire over a sea of silk and laughter. Seraphine Whitmore stood against a marble pillar near the edge of the room, her gloved hands folded too tightly in front of her. She watched as another young lady was swept onto the dance floor, laughing, cheeks flushed pink with attention. Then another, and another. No one looked her way. She had worn her best gown tonight, pale blue, modest, carefully mended at the hem, so no one would notice the frayed thread beneath the lace. She had practiced her smile in the mirror that morning. She had told herself this night would be different. It wasn't. Across the room, her cousin Lady Constance whispered something behind her fan to two other women. They glanced toward Seraphine, then away, then laughed softly among themselves. Seraphine didn't need to hear the words. She already knew the shape of them. She had heard versions of that laughter her whole life. Too plain, too quiet, too poor a match for any man of consequence. Her mother had died believing Seraphine would marry well despite everything, despite the modest dowry, despite a father whose debts still shadowed the family name. Seraphine had stopped believing that long ago. She watched a young viscount bow to another woman 3 feet away from her, his eyes never once drifting toward the pillar where she stood. She felt the old familiar ache settle into her chest, not sharp anymore, just heavy, worn smooth, like a stone she'd carried so long it had become part of her. The orchestra swelled into a new waltz. Couples spun past her in a blur of color and perfume. She tightened her grip on her own elbows, as if holding herself together by hand. A passing footman offered her a glass of lemonade. She took it only so her hands would have something to do. She did not drink it. Across the ballroom, near the tall windows, she caught her own reflection in the dark glass, a pale, solitary shape among all that brightness. She almost didn't recognize the girl staring back, tired, resigned. Already bracing for another evening of being overlooked, she thought of her mother's voice, gentle even in memory. "You have more worth than they will ever see, Sarah." Seraphine almost laughed, not from amusement, from the quiet, bitter understanding that worth meant nothing in a room like this. She straightened her spine anyway, because slouching would only invite more pity, and pity was worse than indifference. Under her breath, so soft that only she could hear it over the music, she whispered the words that had lived in her chest for years. "No gentleman would ever choose me." She did not know, in that moment, that someone near the far end of the ballroom had just noticed her for the first time. A hush moved through the ballroom before the announcement even finished. His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne, Evander Blackthorne. Seraphine had not expected to feel anything. She had heard his name 100 times in drawing rooms and gossip columns. The Duke who never danced, never courted, never lingered at any gathering longer than duty required. A man carved from ice, some called him. Others said grief had hollowed him out years ago and never let him go. She watched him enter anyway, because everyone watched him enter. He was tall, dressed in unadorned black but for the silver thread at his cuffs, and he moved through the crowd the way a current moves through still water, without effort, without apology. Mothers angled their daughters toward him. Daughters arranged their smiles. He acknowledged none of it. His expression was unreadable, composed, faintly tired, in a way only someone studying closely would notice. Seraphine wasn't studying him. She had simply forgotten to look away. Lady Constance appeared at her side, just long enough to murmur, "Don't embarrass yourself staring, cousin. Men like that don't look twice at women like you." Then she was gone, drawn back into the current of silk and ambition. Seraphine lowered her eyes to her lemonade and told herself the sting didn't matter. She had built calluses over places like that for years. What she didn't see, because she had stopped expecting to be seen, was the moment the Duke's gaze passed over the room and paused. Not on the brightest gown, not on the loudest laugh. On her. She stood alone near the pillar, spine straight, despite the loneliness etched plainly across her face. Untouched lemonade in hand, eyes lowered, no simpering, no desperate attempt to be noticed, just quiet, contained dignity. in a room built to reward the opposite. Evander had spent the evening enduring the usual performances, young women angling for his title, their mothers angling harder. He had grown so used to being wanted that he had nearly forgotten what it looked like when someone simply existed in a room without asking anything of him. She wasn't performing loneliness for sympathy. She was carrying it the way a person carries something they've stopped expecting anyone to take from them. He found that, unexpectedly, unbearable to ignore. "Who is that?" he asked the host quietly, without turning his head. The host followed his gaze, surprised. "Miss Seraphine Whitmore, distant relation of Lord Hartwell. Modest fortune, quieter sort. Not much sought after, I'm afraid." "Why not?" The host blinked, as though the question had never occurred to him. "I suppose she simply doesn't draw attention." Evander said nothing to that. He had drawn enough attention in his life to know exactly how little it was worth. He did not cross the room, not yet. Rescuing her with some grand gesture would only confirm what the rest of the ballroom already believed, that she needed saving, that she was an object of pity, rather than a person standing quietly in her own right. Instead, he watched her a moment longer. The careful posture, the chin that refused to drop, even as no one approached, the brief flicker of something raw, before she smoothed her expression back into composure. Restraint, he thought, not invisibility. Restraint. It was the first interesting thing he'd seen all season. Across the ballroom, Seraphine felt it before she understood it. A single gaze, steady and unhurried, settling on her like weight. She lifted her eyes just enough to find the Duke already looking at her. Not with pity, not with curiosity for sport, but with something quieter. Something that unsettled her more than mockery ever had. She looked away first, heart unexpectedly loud in her ears. He did not look away at all. For the first time that evening, in a room built to make her disappear, Seraphine Whitmore had been seen. The letter arrived 3 days later, sealed with a crest Seraphine didn't recognize until she broke it open. Lord Hartwell requests Miss Whitmore's presence to discuss a matter of temporary employment, recommended personally by His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne. She read it twice, certain she had misunderstood. Why would a duke who had spoken not a single word to her recommend her for anything? Lord Hartwell, her distant cousin and reluctant guardian since her father's death, was only too pleased to explain over breakfast, his relief barely disguised as concern. The Duke's household requires someone to manage correspondence and assist with the estate ledgers. His Grace's aunt is too elderly to continue the work, and apparently he requested someone discreet, capable, unconnected to society gossip. He cleared his throat. "He mentioned you by name." "Me," Seraphine repeated, as though saying it twice might make sense of it. "It is a respectable position," Hartwell said quickly, already calculating the relief of one less mouth to feed, one less unmarried cousin, to explain away at gatherings. "And it comes with generous compensation." She had little choice, in truth. A modest dowry did not stretch indefinitely, and pride did not pay for coal in winter. Within the week, her trunk was loaded onto a carriage bound for Ashbourne, the Duke's estate, 3 days' journey from London. The estate, when it finally rose into view past iron gates and an avenue of ancient oaks, was unlike anything she had imagined. Stone the color of old gold, windows that caught the afternoon light like rows of watching eyes. A house that seemed to have been standing in quiet judgment of the world for 300 years. She felt impossibly small stepping out of the carriage. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, met her at the door with a look that assessed and dismissed in the same breath. "You're the new secretary, then?" Not a question. His Grace's aunt managed the correspondence for 30 years before her hands gave out. "Mind you don't make a mess of her order." The servants she passed in the hallway offered the same look, measuring, skeptical, faintly amused. A girl from nowhere, brought in on the Duke's word, with no connections and no explanation. Whispers followed her like a draft through the corridors. "Wonder what she did to earn his notice," she heard one maid murmur to another, not quite out of earshot. "Or what he expects her to do," the second replied, and they both laughed. Seraphine kept her eyes forward and her spine straight. She had survived worse rooms than this one. Her quarters were modest but clean, tucked near the east wing, far from the family's apartments. A clear, deliberate distance that told her exactly where she stood in the household's understanding of her. Guest, but not guest. Staff, but not quite staff either. Something unclassified. Something that made people nervous. She did not see the Duke that first day, nor the second. She told herself she hadn't expected to, that his recommendation had likely been a passing courtesy, already forgotten amid the business of running an estate this size. But on the third evening, candle in hand, making her way back from the study with a stack of correspondence, she rounded a corner in the long gallery and nearly collided with him. Evander caught the candle before it fell. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, his voice quieter than she remembered from the ballroom, almost careful. "I trust the household has made you welcome." She thought of Mrs. Pruitt's sharp assessment, the whispered laughter in the corridor, the careful distance of her quarters. "They have made me aware, Your Grace," she said, before she could stop herself. "Welcome may take longer." Something flickered across his face. Not offense, but the faintest, unexpected trace of amusement. "Yes," he said. "I imagine it will." He did not explain why he'd brought her here. She did not ask, but as he continued down the corridor, and she stood alone with her candle and her stack of letters, Seraphine understood, with a small and unfamiliar flutter of nerves, that something in her life had just shifted, and there was no clear path back to who she'd been before. The house party had been planned for months, Ashbourne's first grand gathering since the old Duke's passing, a chance for society to remind itself that the estate and its master were still very much a prize worth pursuing. Seraphine had not been meant to attend as a guest. Her place was meant to be the study, buried in correspondence while the great hall filled with silk and laughter. But Evander's aunt, frail and sharp-eyed, had insisted otherwise. "You manage half this household's business now," she said, fixing Seraphine with a look that allowed no argument. "You will not hide in a closet while lesser women preen in the ballroom." So Seraphine had dressed in her one good gown, pale green, simply cut, and entered a room far grander than the one she'd left behind in London, only to find the same cruelty wearing finer lace. "Isn't that the secretary?" a voice carried, not quietly enough to be accidental. "I heard the Duke brought her from nowhere, no family worth mentioning." Perhaps he felt sorry for her. Seraphine kept her chin level and her hands steady around her glass, the way she'd trained herself to do years ago. She had survived London's pillars and whispers. She told herself Ashbourne's would be no different. She was wrong. Lady Vivian Ashford arrived an hour into the evening, the Duke's former intended, society murmured, though the engagement had quietly dissolved 2 years prior. She moved through the room like she still owned it, and perhaps, in the minds of half the guests, she did. Her eyes found Seraphine within minutes. "How curious," Vivian said, loud enough to draw the attention of 3 nearby groups, her smile sweet as poisoned sugar. "The Duke's secretary, dressed as though she belongs among us." She circled, slow and deliberate, studying Seraphine's gown the way one studies a flaw in a painting. "Tell me, did you borrow that dress, or simply misunderstand the invitation?" Laughter rippled outward, soft and cruel. "I was invited, my lady," Seraphine said evenly, though her pulse had begun to climb. "Invited to manage his ledgers, surely, not to stand among his peers." Vivian's voice sharpened, the smile thinning. "Some women mistake a man's convenience for his regard. It's a tedious mistake to watch." The room had gone quiet enough now that every word landed like a struck bell. Seraphine felt the old, familiar heat crawl up her throat. Shame, sharp and humiliating, the kind she'd spent a lifetime learning to swallow. "I manage his correspondence, my lady," she said, voice low but clear. "Nothing more has been implied, by him or by me." "Hasn't it?" Vivian stepped closer, eyes glittering. Then perhaps you should remember your place before the entire room is forced to remind you of it. Seraphine's hands trembled around her glass, but she did not look away, and she did not cry. Not here, not in front of women who would treasure the sight of it for seasons to come. Across the hall, Evander had gone still the moment he registered the shape of the crowd, the particular cruelty in Vivienne's posture. He moved through the room quickly, jaw tight, but by the time he reached the edge of the gathering, Vivienne had already delivered her final blow. "Run along now, Miss Whitmore. This room is for guests, not staff who've forgotten themselves." Seraphine set down her glass with great care, the only outward sign of how close she stood to breaking, and excused herself before anyone could see her unravel. She did not run. She walked, slow and composed, until she reached the empty terrace beyond the doors, and only then did she let the tears come, silent and furious, her hands pressed hard against the stone railing. Behind her, through the glass, she heard the party resume its glittering rhythm, as though nothing at all had happened. She had been humiliated before. She had not expected it to feel like this, not in a place she had, against her better judgment, begun to think of as somewhere she might belong. She did not mention the terrace to anyone. By morning, she had folded the humiliation away, the way she folded everything painful. Neatly, privately, somewhere it could not be used against her twice. But something in her had also hardened into resolve. If the household believed her worthless, she would simply make herself impossible to dismiss. She began with the ledgers. Mrs. Pruitt had long complained, quietly and without hope of remedy, that the estate's accounts had fallen into disarray since the old Duke's illness. Tenant payments miscounted, repairs unpaid, debts owed to merchants who'd grown patient out of respect rather than confidence. Seraphine spent 3 nights by candlelight, untangling years of careless bookkeeping, until the numbers finally told a coherent story. She brought the corrected ledgers to Evander's study herself. He studied the pages for a long moment, brow furrowed, then looked up at her with something close to disbelief. "This discrepancy with the northern tenants, we've been chasing it for 2 years. You were owed money, not owing it," she said simply. "Someone simply transposed a figure in 1820, and no one corrected it since." He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her, the way one looks at something unexpectedly valuable. "Thank you," he said quietly, and it was not the tone of a man thanking his secretary. It was the tone of a man who had been carrying something heavy and just felt it lighten. She did not stop there. She found Tom Reyes, a tenant farmer whose family had fallen behind after a poor harvest, standing outside the steward's office with his cap in his hands, shame written plainly across his face as he prepared to beg for mercy he didn't expect to receive. Seraphine intervened quietly, restructuring his payments across the season rather than demanding them at once. A solution buried in the ledgers all along, simply never offered. "Why would you help me?" Tom asked, bewildered. "Because no one should be punished for a bad harvest," she said. "And because I know what it costs to ask for mercy you don't expect to get." Word of small kindnesses traveled slowly through a household, but it traveled. She found the Duke's younger sister, Lady Cecilia, crying in the garden one afternoon, frightened after overhearing a suitor discuss her dowry, as though she were a transaction rather than a person. Seraphine sat with her for an hour, saying little, simply present, until Cecilia's tears dried and her shoulders unclenched. "You didn't tell me it would be fine," Cecilia said afterward, wiping her eyes. "Everyone else always says that." "I don't know that it will be," Seraphine said honestly. "But you don't have to face it alone right now." Cecilia looked at her with something like wonder, the way one looks at a person who has finally told the truth. The garden itself had been neglected for years, overgrown, forgotten, the late Duchess's roses choked beneath weeds. No one had thought worth the effort. Seraphine began clearing it in the early mornings before her duties began, not because anyone asked her to, but because something in her needed to tend to a thing that had been overlooked too long. The staff noticed. Mrs. Pruitt, who had once measured her with suspicion, began leaving a second cup of tea on the study tray without being asked. A scullery maid, frightened after a frightening encounter with an aggressive tradesman in the village, found Seraphine first, when she needed someone to believe her. Not Mrs. Pruitt, not the Duke, but the secretary, who had somehow, quietly, become someone people trusted. None of it was loud. None of it was meant to be noticed. But Evander noticed. He watched the ledgers balance, the tenants stop fearing eviction, his sister laugh again, his staff soften around a woman they'd once dismissed as beneath their attention. He said nothing of it directly, but he began finding reasons to pass through the study in the evenings, reasons that had little to do with correspondence, and everything to do with the quiet, steady proof that Seraphine Whitmore was not the invisible woman society believed her to be. She was, he was beginning to understand, simply the only honest person in his entire household. It started with the gardens. Evander found her there one evening, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled, and dirt smudged along her jaw, coaxing a stubborn rosebush back from the brink of ruin. He should have walked past. He found himself stopping instead. "My mother planted these," he said. Seraphine looked up, startled, then quickly attempted to brush the dirt from her hands, as though that might undo the impropriety of being caught mid-labor by a duke. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I should have asked before." "Don't apologize." He crouched beside her, an act so unexpected she simply stared at him. She loved this garden more than anything in the house. After she passed, no one had the heart to tend it. I think we all preferred to let it die quietly, rather than watch it struggle without her. "It isn't dying," Seraphine said softly. "It's just been waiting for someone to notice it again." He looked at her for a long moment, and she understood, with a small jolt, that he was no longer speaking only of roses. After that evening, he began finding reasons to walk the gardens at dusk, and she began finding reasons to still be there when he did. Neither of them named it. Both of them noticed. They began speaking of small things first. The stubbornness of English weather, the absurdity of certain society customs, the particular exhaustion of pretending interest in conversations that mattered to no one. Then, slowly, of larger things. "I never wanted the title," he admitted one evening, the two of them seated on a stone bench as the sky bruised into violet. "My brother was meant to inherit it. He had the temperament for it. Warmth, ease, the ability to make people feel important without trying. I only ever learned how to be respected, never how to be liked." "You're liked more than you think," Seraphine said. "Your sister adores you. Mrs. Pruitt would walk through fire before she let anyone speak ill of you in her hearing." "And you?" he asked, quieter. She didn't answer immediately, and the silence between them grew warm, rather than uncomfortable. "I think," she said finally, "that you are not nearly as cold as everyone insists you are." He laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, as though he'd forgotten the shape of his own amusement. "You're the only person at Ashbourne unafraid to tell me I'm wrong. Someone should be." Their evenings became a quiet ritual, neither acknowledged aloud. The library, more often than not, Evander reading correspondence by the fire, while Seraphine worked through ledgers at the long table. The silence between them, companionable rather than empty. Sometimes he read passages aloud, simply because he wanted to hear her laugh at the absurd ones. Sometimes she told him about her mother, the gentle, hopeful woman who had died believing her daughter deserved more than the world had ever offered her. "She would have liked you," Seraphine said one night, surprising herself with the admission. "Why do you say that?" "Because she always said worth wasn't loud. She said it was quiet, and patient, and easy to miss if you weren't paying attention." Seraphine glanced at him. "You pay attention, Your Grace, more than anyone gives you credit for." He held her gaze longer than propriety allowed, something unspoken passing between them. Not declaration, not yet, but the unmistakable shift of two guarded people, slowly, carefully, allowing themselves to be known. "Evander," he said quietly, "when it's only us, I'd like you to use my name." She felt the request settle somewhere warm beneath her ribs. "Evander," she repeated, testing the shape of it. He smiled, small, unguarded, entirely unlike the composed mask society had grown used to. Neither of them spoke of what was growing between them, but it had taken root all the same, quiet and steady, the way the roses had. Waiting, simply, for someone willing to tend it. The summons came from the Dowager Duchess of Rothmere, Evander's godmother, and the closest thing the family had to a matriarch, and with it came an ultimatum dressed as advice. "The estate's reputation has suffered since your father's passing," she said over tea, her tone clipped and final. "Whispers of financial trouble. Whispers about your secretary." She said the word with deliberate distaste. "It is time you settled the matter properly, Evander. Lady Vivienne's family is willing to renew the arrangement. Her dowry would secure Ashbourne's finances for a generation. The engagement could be announced within the month." Evander's jaw tightened. "I have no intention of renewing anything with Lady Vivienne." "Then perhaps you'd care to explain to the family solicitor why the estate's debts have grown more pressing than you've admitted to anyone," the dowager said, sliding a folded letter across the table. "Your father's investments in the shipping venture failed quietly last winter. You have perhaps 2 seasons before creditors stop being patient. A marriage like Vivienne's would resolve it instantly. Sentiment will not." Evander stared at the figures, the floor of his certainty shifting beneath him. He had known the estate was strained. He had not known it was this close to collapse. Seraphine learned of it not from him, but from Mrs. Pruitt, ashen-faced, clutching a letter that had arrived for the steward by mistake. "They mean to force the engagement," she whispered. "Lady Vivienne's family has threatened to call in every debt connected to their name unless His Grace agrees by month's end." Seraphine felt the floor tilt beneath her too, though for entirely different reasons. She found Evander in the study that evening, the ledgers spread before him like evidence of a verdict already decided. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up immediately. "The estate is in greater difficulty than I let myself believe. My father hid it well. I inherited the consequences without the warning. And the engagement?" His silence answered before his words could. "It would solve everything. The debts, the estate's reputation, my family's security." He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there wasn't desire. It was exhaustion, and something close to grief. "It would solve everything, except the one thing I actually want." "Then don't do it," she said, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "And watch Cecilia's future collapse along with this house. Watch generations of tenants lose their homes because I chose feeling over duty." His voice cracked, just slightly. "I don't have the luxury of choosing only myself, Seraphine." The words landed like a verdict, and she understood, with sick clarity, exactly where she stood in his calculations. Necessary, perhaps even loved, but ultimately not load-bearing enough to outweigh an estate's survival. Before she could respond, the study door opened without warning. Lady Vivienne stood in the threshold, smiling with the particular satisfaction of someone arriving exactly on cue. "How touching," she said, eyes sweeping over the scene. The ledgers, the closeness, the unmistakable charge in the air between them. "Though I imagine the Duke has already explained the realities to you, Miss Whitmore. Sentiment is a luxury this house can no longer afford." "Vivienne," Evander started. "The arrangement is already moving forward, Your Grace, whether convenient or not. My father has informed the solicitors. Society will expect an announcement within the fortnight." Her gaze settled on Seraphine, cold and triumphant. "I suggest you remember your place before this becomes considerably more humiliating than it needs to be." She left as abruptly as she'd arrived, the door clicking shut with quiet finality. Seraphine stood frozen, the warmth of the past weeks collapsing into something brittle and uncertain. Is that truly the future, Evander? Hers, decided for you by debt and inheritance? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Not with certainty. Not yet. Not while the numbers on the desk still threatened everyone he was responsible for. And in that unbearable silence, Seraphine understood that everything they'd quietly built between them was about to be tested by the one force neither of them could simply will away. The announcement ball had been arranged with brutal efficiency. Within a fortnight, as Vivienne had promised, Ashbourne's great hall filled once more with London's finest, gathered, society believed, to witness the formal renewal of the Duke's engagement. Seraphine had not been invited. She attended anyway, slipping in through the servants' entrance, unable to stay away from the moment that would decide everything. She found a place near the back of the hall, half hidden behind a column, watching as the Dowager Duchess took her position near the dais, watching as Vivian descended the staircase in triumphant white, watching as Evander stood rigid near the center of the room, the weight of an entire estate balanced on his shoulders. The solicitor had spent the past week buried in the ledgers, Seraphine's corrected ledgers, her careful accounting of every tenant payment and recovered debt. 2 nights ago, she had brought Evander a final discovery, a forgotten investment from his grandfather's time, long dormant, now matured into a sum substantial enough to settle the worst of the shipping losses without sacrificing anything at all. Not a fortune, but enough to remove the one argument that had made surrender feel inevitable. She had given him the truth. What he did with it now was his alone. The Dowager raised her glass, ready to begin the formal address. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate. Forgive me," Evander said, his voice cutting clean through the room. "But there has been a misunderstanding." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Vivian's smile faltered. "The estate's financial difficulties, which some hoped would force my hand tonight," Evander continued, "have been resolved. Thoroughly, without need of any marriage arranged to settle a debt I no longer owe." He turned, deliberately, toward Vivian. "I am grateful for your family's patience these past weeks, but I will not be renewing our engagement, now or at any time." Vivian's composure cracked, fury flashing beneath the careful powder. "Evander, you cannot possibly mean—" "I mean it entirely." The Dowager's voice rose, sharp with alarm. "The family's reputation, the arrangements already made, were made without my consent and against my wishes," Evander said. "I will not spend my life paying for debts that no longer exist." His eyes moved across the room then, searching until they found her. Seraphine, half hidden near the column, breath caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. He crossed the ballroom without hesitation, the crowd parting before him in stunned silence, until he stood before her, ignoring every scandalized whisper rising in his wake. "You shouldn't be near the back of a room you helped save," he said quietly. Tears gathered, unbidden, in her eyes. "No gentleman would ever choose me, Your Grace," she whispered, the old wound, the old whisper, surfacing one final time. He took her hand, gently, deliberately, and did not let go. Then he turned to face the entire assembled aristocracy. Every powdered face, every judgmental whisper, every person who had ever measured her worth and found it wanting. "Then allow me," he said, his voice carrying clear across the silent hall, "to disappoint society." The ballroom held its breath. Somewhere near the front, the Dowager's glass trembled in her grip. Vivian stood frozen, her triumph dissolving into something close to humiliation. But Evander did not look away from Seraphine, not once, his hand steady around hers, as though daring anyone, in that glittering, cruel room, to suggest she did not belong exactly where she stood. For the first time in her life, Seraphine Whitmore was chosen, not quietly, not privately, but before the very people who had once decided she never would be. The ballroom emptied slowly after that, the scandal too rich not to be carried home and dissected in 100 drawing rooms by morning. But Evander did not stay to watch it unravel. He led Seraphine through the side doors, past the startled footman, out onto the same terrace where she had once cried alone, certain no one would ever come looking for her there. This time, he came willingly. "You should have told me about the investment sooner," he said, though there was no accusation in it, only something closer to wonder. "You could have let me marry her. You could have let the estate solve itself the easy way and stayed silent." "I didn't do it to stop the engagement," Seraphine said. "I did it because the truth mattered, whether or not it changed anything for me. It changed everything for me." He turned to face her fully, the moonlight catching the unguarded look on his face. None of the composure society knew him by, none of the careful distance he wore like armor. "Do you understand what you've done to this house, Seraphine? The ledgers, the tenants, Cecilia, even Mrs. Pruitt, God help her, who hasn't smiled this freely in a decade. I only did what needed doing. No. His voice was quiet, but firm. Plenty of people see what needs doing, and look away, because it costs them something to act. You never once looked away. Not from the Ledgers, not from Tom Reyes, not from my sister crying in the garden, not from me. He paused, and something in his expression cracked open further. Every room I have ever entered in my life expected me to be a duke first, a title, an obligation, a solution to someone else's problem. His hand found hers again, steady, despite the unsteadiness in his voice. You're the first person who ever simply saw the man. Seraphine's breath caught. Evander, I'm not finished. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see every flicker of vulnerability crossing his face, things he had clearly never permitted anyone to witness before. I spent years believing affection was a luxury men in my position couldn't afford. That duty and feeling were separate currencies, and I'd been given only enough of one to spend. He shook his head slowly. Then you arrived, uninvited into every part of this house that mattered, and ruined that belief entirely. I never meant to ruin anything. You ruined the parts that deserved ruining. His thumb traced gently over her knuckles. I don't know how to say this the way poets do. I've never had reason to learn, but I know that the estate feels less like a burden since you came. I know my sister laughs again. I know I find myself inventing reasons to walk through gardens I haven't cared about in years, simply because you might be there. He exhaled, unsteady. I know that tonight, standing in that ballroom, the only unbearable outcome was the thought of you walking away, believing yourself unchosen. Tears slipped freely down Seraphine's face now, though nothing in her expression suggested sorrow. I spent my whole life believing I would always be the woman standing alone by the pillar. Overlooked, talked about, never spoken to. You were never overlooked, he said softly. You were simply waiting for someone willing to look properly. And did you, she whispered, look properly? I haven't stopped since that first night in the ballroom. He lifted her hand to his lips, the gesture slow and deliberate, nothing like the careless gallantry she'd watched other men perform for other women all her life. I love you, Seraphine Whitmore. Not the secretary, not the woman who saved my estate. You, exactly as you are, exactly as you've always been, long before anyone else thought to notice. She laughed, soft and disbelieving, the sound catching somewhere between joy and years of old grief, finally loosening their grip. No gentleman would ever choose me, she murmured, the words losing their old bitter weight with every repetition. Then it's fortunate, Evander said, drawing her gently closer, that I never had any interest in being merely a gentleman, only in being the man who chose you. The wedding took place in early spring, when the gardens Seraphine had once rescued from neglect were finally blooming in earnest, roses climbing the stone walls in defiant, riotous color, as though the estate itself wanted to mark the occasion. Society, predictably, found a way to make peace with what it had once mocked. The same women who had once whispered behind fans now curtsied with practiced warmth, recalling, with convenient amnesia, that they had always sensed something remarkable about Miss Whitmore. Lady Constance, who had once warned her cousin not to embarrass herself staring at a duke, now claimed proudly to anyone who'd listen that she had introduced them. Seraphine found she no longer cared either way. Their approval, once the thing she'd ached for her entire life, had quietly lost its power over her the moment Evander took her hand before the only room that had ever truly mattered. The estate itself transformed in the months that followed. With the dormant investment settled and the ledgers finally honest, Ashbourne flourished, tenant farms repaired, debts cleared, a household that had once run on quiet fear, now running on something closer to trust. Tom Reyes's harvest came in strong that autumn, the first in 3 years. Mrs. Pruitt wept, unashamed, the day Seraphine was formally introduced as the new Duchess, muttering something about always having known there was steel beneath that quiet composure. Cecilia, who had once cried in the garden over a suitor who saw only her dowry, found herself courted that season by a man who asked, unprompted, what she actually wanted from her own life. A question, she confided to Seraphine, she credited entirely to watching her brother's marriage unfold with such uncommon honesty. Evander remained, in essence, exactly who he had always been, composed, measured, more comfortable with action than declaration. But something in him had visibly eased, the rigid posture of a man bracing permanently against expectation, softened into something closer to peace. He still preferred quiet evenings in the library to crowded ballrooms, still found society's performances tiresome, but he no longer carried them alone. "You've ruined me for solitude," he told Seraphine one evening, only half joking, as she settled beside him with a stack of correspondence. Neither of them particularly wanted to address that night. "I should hope so," she said. "Solitude never suited you. You simply hadn't found anyone worth disturbing it for." It was nearly a year later, at a ball hosted by the very same family who had once excluded her so cruelly, that the final symmetry of her journey revealed itself. She entered the grand room in deep emerald silk, the Duchess of Ashbourne now in more than name, and watched as every gentleman in the room rose properly, bowed correctly, offered the kind of attention she had once starved for, as a girl standing alone against a marble pillar. She walked past every one of them. Evander stood near the far end of the hall, exactly as he had the very first night she'd noticed him, composed, watchful, his eyes finding hers the moment she crossed the threshold. He extended his hand the instant she reached him, the gesture unhurried, certain, utterly unconcerned with who might be watching. She took it without hesitation. "No gentleman would ever choose me," she murmured. More memory now than wound, the words finally stripped of every ounce of their old, bitter weight. "Then it's fortunate," Evander said, drawing her close, his voice low enough for her alone, "that you were never waiting on a gentleman at all. Only on me." She smiled then, not because the room had finally accepted her, not because society's judgment had reversed itself, but because, for the first time in her life, she understood with complete certainty that she no longer needed it to. She had been chosen, publicly, deliberately, irrevocably, and she had never once needed anyone's permission to be worthy of it. The end. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to say thank you. It means a lot to my channel. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Like and subscribe to Duke Tales by May I. For more. See you in my next story.